You have felt this at the grocery store, on your phone bill, in banking fees, in the quiet sense that across totally different parts of Canadian life, you keep running into the same handful of companies. Not just high prices, the same names. And that points to a bigger question that why life feels expensive. Why do so many of Canada's most important industries end up dominated by so few firms? Now, we're taught that free markets create competition. If prices rise too far, new rivals enter. If profits get too high, someone undercuts them. But in Canada, that story keeps breaking down. Not because markets don't exist, because markets don't automatically become competitive. They depend on structure, on geography, on infrastructure, on regulation, on switching costs, on who can realistically enter and who can't. And Canada is where you can see that very clearly. Because this country has enormous distances, a relatively small and concentrated population, very fragmented provincial rules, and a long tradition of choosing stability, domestic control, and investment certainty, sometimes at the expense of rivalry. So, this is not just a story about groceries or telecom or banking, it's about something deeper. A market can be legally open and still be functionally hard to challenge. And once you see that, a lot of Canada starts to make more sense. Why do free markets don't always mean more competition? The usual image of a free market is simple. Lots of firms, lots of choice, prices pushed down by competition. And sometimes that's true, but real markets aren't built in a vacuum. They're shaped by barriers. You have fixed costs, you have infrastructure, scale, regulation, even customer inertia. You need control over land, you need networks, or you even need distribution. So the important question isn't whether competition is technically allowed, it's whether dominant firms feel meaningful pressure. Because a market can have private ownership, multiple brands, and no formal monopoly, yet still leave customers with weak leverage. That's what concentration changes. Not necessarily the existence of choice, the force of competition. How hard firms have to fight for your business. How easy it is for you to switch. How likely a new entrant is to survive. How much real pressure there is to improve service or even cut margins. And that's where the myth begins to fall apart. Competition is not the default setting of capitalism. It has to be made possible. Now, why does Canada tend toward concentration? Canada has structural features that naturally favor scale because the country is huge. The population is relatively small, and outside of few dense corridors, people are spread far apart. Now, that matters because businesses don't serve land, they serve customers across that land. A company entering Canada has to ask how many warehouses, trucks, technicians, towers, stores, or branches do we need before this makes economic sense? In a country like this, reaching customers is expensive. And when serving the market is expensive, larger firms gain an advantage quickly. Then there's internal fragmentation. Canada is one country, but often behaves like a patchwork of semi-separate markets. Different rules across provinces, licensing systems, and operating conditions can make national expansion harder than it looks. That hurts challengers more than the incumbents. And then you have policy. For decades, Canada often prioritized other goals alongside competition and sometimes even above it. Stable banks, domestic control in strategic sectors, very broad infrastructure coverage, investment certainty, those are not irrational goals, but they come with trade-offs. And over time, those trade-offs helped produce an economy where incumbency is unusually durable. Not because competition is illegal, because the environment often rewards size. It protects established firms and makes serious entry difficult. Now, grocery is the most visible version of that problem. If there's one place Canadians feel this the most directly, it's groceries. Because grocery economics aren't abstract. they hit every single week. And when food prices rise, the first explanations are usually inflation, supply chains, fuel, labor, war, weather, pandemic. Those all matter, but they don't explain the full shape of the problem. The grocery market Canadians rely on is already highly concentrated. Now, that doesn't mean every high price is the result of some secret decision in a boardroom. It means fewer firms are in a position to compete those prices away. And groceries are much harder to enter than people assume. A rival doesn't just need shelf space, it needs distribution, warehousing, refrigeration, supplier relationships. It needs real estate, procurement scale, regional coverage. It needs an entire logistics system. And even before any of that, it needs somewhere to open. That's why property controls matter so much. If prime locations are restricted or tied up through exclusivity arrangements, then competition can be blocked long before a customer ever sees a new store. So when people say, if prices are too high, why doesn't just someone enter? That question misses structure. Enter with what infrastructure, at what scale, on what land, and against whose purchasing power. This is what concentration looks like in practice. It is not the absence of a market, but a market where scale protects itself. Entrants need logistics and sites. In telecom, they need spectrum and infrastructure. In banking, they need licensing, compliance, trust, and a way to persuade people to move their financial lives. So the issue isn't just whether money can be made, it's whether a challenger can survive long enough to matter. That's why economists care about contestability, not just how many firms exist, but how easy is it to challenge them. And in Canada, across several major sectors, contestability is weak. That's why the usual market story breaks down. The theory assumes entry, but the structure often prevents it. Telecom, where the system becomes obvious. Telecom makes the underlying logic impossible to ignore. This is an industry built on massive fixed costs. Spectrum, towers, backhaul, maintenance, billing systems, retail presence, technical support, constant capital investment. And then you place that industry inside a country as large and as unevenly populated as Canada, the result is predictable. Not a market that naturally produces many strong national players, a market that tilts toward a few giants. That's why telecom has always been about more than prices. It's about structure. Should incumbents be forced to share infrastructure? But then on what terms? How do you create room for rivals without undermining investment incentives? How do you lower prices without weakening build out in expensive regions? Those are the real trade-offs. And in Canada, they're sharper because network expansion is genuinely costly. There's also the role of policy. Foreign ownership limits for years made it very hard for large-scale outside entries possible. Whether those rules were justified is a separate question. The point is that concentration here was not just the result of private firms winning. Policy shaped who could realistically compete. And then there's the customer side of things. Telecom markets are very sticky. When you have contracts, bundles, device financing, service complexity, and the fear of disruption all make switching harder than it should be. That friction matters. Because competition is not just about how many firms exist, it's also about how easy it is for the customers to punish a firm by leaving. If leaving is painful enough, even multiple firms can stop behaving like a fiercely competitive market. Now we come to banking. The case Canada deliberately preserved. Banking is different from the other two sectors because here concentration was not merely tolerated. It was often defended. Canada's banking system is dominated by the big six. And unlike in many other sectors, that concentration has long been tied to a public argument. And that argument is stability. Banks are not treated like ordinary consumer businesses. They sit at the center of credit, payments, mortgages, savings, and the national economic confidence. And history helped. After 2008, Canada's relatively stable banking system reinforced the idea that a concentrated, tightly regulated model had advantages. And that argument is serious. But again, stability comes with costs. Fewer firms, less aggressive rivalry, higher switching friction, more durable customer capture. Because switching banks is not like changing grocery stores. It means moving paychecks, bill payments, mortgage arrangements, savings, credit, auto debits, maybe even a business account. And that level of entanglement protects incumbents. A challenger doesn't just need a better product, it needs people to take a real life risk. And that's why reforms like open banking matter. Not because they create instant fragmentation, but because they lower the cost of leaving. And that's the hidden lever in concentrated markets. Make exit easier, and incumbents have to behave differently. So banking reveals something more important about Canada's economy. That sometimes concentration persists not because nobody noticed it, but because policymakers accepted it as the price of another goal. And in this case, it's resilience. This is not just about corporate greed. Now, there's a version of this story that turns into morality play. Greedy corporations versus ordinary people. And sometimes corporate behavior deserves criticism. But that framing can hide more important truth. The deeper problem is structural. These firms did not emerge outside the system. In many cases, they are the predictable winners of the system, of geography, of infrastructure economics, of regulatory design, of legacy policy choices, of barriers that accumulated slowly and became normal. That matters because if the structure is the problem, then outrage alone won't fix it. You can replace executives and keep the same barriers. You can shame a firm and still leave the market hard to enter. You can punish symptoms and preserve the architecture. And that is why this story is bigger than just pricing. It's about how a country designs capitalism. And this is the central realization. Markets are not neutral spaces that exist before politics. They are designed environments. Governments decide merger rules, ownership rules, infrastructure access, switching rights, data portability, land use frameworks, the regulatory burden of entry, the degree to which dominant firms can consolidate further. So when a market becomes concentrated, that outcome is rarely purely natural. It's shaped, sometimes intentionally, sometimes passively, sometimes through old decisions whose effects compound over time. And that's the thread connecting groceries with telecom and banking. These are different sectors, but have the same pattern. Entry is hard, scale matters, customers are sticky, policy choices reinforce incumbency. And the result is weaker pressure than the language of free market would lead people to expect. So this is not really a debate about markets versus government. It's about what kind of market a government creates. And to be fair, defenders of the Canadian model are not wrong about everything. Canada is expensive to serve. Rural coverage is costly. Infrastructure requires a large and a very patient investment. A fragmented banking system could introduce new risks, and concentration alone does not automatically prove abuse. So the goal is not maximum fragmentation for its own sake. The goal is pressure. Enough pressure that dominant firms still have to fight for customers. Enough pressure that entry remains possible. Enough pressure that switching is realistic, and enough pressure that comfort does not harden into complacency. That is the distinction that matters. Not whether Canada looks exactly like the United States, but whether Canada has drifted too far toward protecting incumbents and away from preserving rivalry. Now, if that diagnosis is right, then reform is not mysterious. First, merger scrutiny has to be tougher in already concentrated sectors. Because once a market is highly concentrated, even a small increase in consolidation can weaken rivalry in ways that are hard to reverse. Second, barriers to entry have to be attacked directly. In groceries, that includes property controls and exclusivity arrangements that make viable expansion harder. Third, switching costs have to come down. You need cleaner telecom pricing. You need data portability. You need open banking. You need simpler mortgage transfers. And just in general, you need less friction across the board. Because consumer choice only matters when exit is realistic. Fourth, Canada has to reduce its own internal fragmentation. If crossing provincial boundaries remains unnecessarily difficult, incumbents keep an advantage and challengers stay small. And finally, legacy policy shields need to be re-examined honestly. Some restrictions serve the public interest, some mainly protect incumbents. Those are not the same thing. The hard part is that none of this produces overnight relief. Competition policy is slow. It changes incentives before it changes prices. But without it, every affordability debate becomes very reactive. You outrage at outcomes without having much change to the structure reducing them. So, why does Canada so often feel like it's run by the same few companies? Because free markets do not automatically produce strong competition. They produce outcomes based on the environment around them. And in Canada, that environment has often favored scale, stability, and incumbency more than rivalry. In groceries, that shows up in logistics, land, and distribution. In telecom, it shows up in networks, spectrum, and switching friction. And in banking, it shows up in trust, regulation, and customer entanglement. If this changed how you see the world, share it with someone who needs to see it too. Let me know in the comments which one you want next. I'll see you there.